For most of us, a stroke means one thing: call an ambulance, get to a hospital fast, right? But what if the problem isn't just seen as a medical emergency? What if it's seen as something spiritual? This is where it gets really fascinating, and we're going to dive right into that complex world where health and belief collide.
So let's start with a really stark number: 45%. In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, like in Nigeria, the mortality rate from a stroke can be that high. That's a huge number, and it points to a massive health crisis. But the story behind that number, well, it's a lot more complicated than you might imagine.
And that leads us to the core question of this whole explainer. What if the path to survival doesn't always lead through a hospital? We're looking at a bunch of research from the region, and it tells a powerful story about why, for so many people, the journey to getting better involves traditional healers, it involves prayer, it involves a whole world of belief that operates completely outside of a modern clinic.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get a handle on just how big this crisis is. Then we'll dive into the two totally different ways of seeing what a stroke even is. After that, we'll look at the specific supernatural beliefs, how that leads to a major choice in treatment, and finally, how we might be able to build a bridge between these two worlds for better care. All right, first up, Africa's growing stroke crisis. And a huge piece of this story is what happens in the shadows, the stuff that's happening way outside the formal medical system. And that's precisely why a simple medical diagnosis just doesn't cut it here. I mean, think about it. Some studies suggest that only about a third of stroke patients in this region might ever even go to a hospital. That tells you right there there's a whole other story, a completely different worldview at play. So from a purely medical perspective, a stroke is pretty cut and dried, right? It's a brain attack. Blood flow to the brain gets cut off and cells start to die. The goal is to get that blood flowing again and then work on rehab. Simple enough. But now look at this. This is where you see the two worlds collide. A doctor sees high blood pressure, but a family might see it as the will of God. A doctor sees a blocked artery or a blood clot, but the community might see it as witchcraft, a spiritual attack. And this isn't just, some fringe idea. This is a deeply, deeply held worldview for millions of people. So let's dig a little deeper into that, into the specific supernatural causes people believe are behind all this. Because if you don't get this part, you'll never understand the choices people make. And wow, this chart really puts it in perspective. When you pull together data from different studies, it's clear these beliefs are everywhere. Look at that. 45% in one study said a stroke was the will of God. Then you have another big chunk blaming spiritual attacks or witchcraft. The purely medical reasons, they're just a small slice of the pie. It's a totally different way of understanding the world. And this right here, this quote from a survivor, just brings that data to life. He says, "We say it is an animal, a bad devil." So a stroke isn't something wrong with your brain's plumbing. No, it's an entity, an evil thing that gets inside you. And if you believe that, you're not going to reach for aspirin, are you? You're going to look for a spiritual solution, like an exorcism. Or take this story from an 80-year-old woman. She was doing well in her business, starting to build a better house, and then, boom, she has a stroke. For her, the two things are directly connected. Her success made someone jealous, and that jealousy turned into a curse. It's a powerful reminder that health isn't just about the body. It's tied up in your relationships with your neighbors and your place in the community. Okay, so you have these deeply held beliefs. Now, what happens in that terrifying moment when a loved one actually has a stroke? This is where everything comes to a head. It's a true fork in the road, forcing a choice between two completely different paths to healing. Now, what's interesting is that the data shows most people, almost 82% in one study, do actually go to the hospital first. But look at that other number. Almost 17% go straight to a traditional healer. And that doesn't even count the people who go to the hospital, get frustrated, and then seek out traditional care. So the big question is, why? Well, the reasons are a real mix of practical problems and deep-seated beliefs. Of course, the cost of care is a huge one. But it's also things like a genuine fear of medical procedures. An injection, for instance, might be seen as creating an opening for evil spirits to enter the body. Then you've got a lack of trust in modern medicine, feeling like hospital staff treat you poorly. And all of that is on top of the core belief that, hey, this isn't a medical problem anyway. And this quote from a patient just says it all. She says, "After giving out blood, they told me that they do not see any problem with my tests." Imagine that. You know something is terribly wrong with you, but the doctors and their machines say, nope, everything looks fine. For a doctor, that's a puzzle.
But for her, it's proof. It confirms her suspicion that the hospital is looking in the wrong place. They can't see the real spiritual cause. So you've got this huge gap between these two worlds. How on earth do you improve care? Well, the good news is the research doesn't just point out the problems, it also suggests a way forward. And it's all about building a bridge.
It really comes down to three key things. First, and this is huge, medical professionals have to actually acknowledge and respect these beliefs, not just wave them away as superstition. Second, they need to team up with the people the community already trusts. We're talking pastors, imams, local healers. Bring them into the conversation about health. And finally, the care itself has to be integrated. It has to recognize that for the patient, healing their spirit is every bit as real and important as healing their body.
And really, that's the bottom line here. The single biggest takeaway from all this research, a purely medical, by-the-book approach is just not working for a lot of people. For rehabilitation to have any chance of success in this context, it has to be holistic. It's got to leave room for faith, for prayer, and for the cultural beliefs that help people make sense of what's happened to them. So we're left with this really big, important question. And it's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about how these two powerful systems of knowledge can actually work together. How can modern medicine build trust and become a partner in healing, instead of seeming like an enemy to centuries of faith and tradition? Figuring that out, well, that's the real challenge.